Let's talk about Death Battle. In 2010, back before we ate Tide Pods and spoonfuls of cinnamon, there existed a little company based in Dallas, Texas called Screw Attack that focused on providing creator-driven content geared towards the most oppressed group of them all, gamers. One such employee was Ben Singer, who went from being one of the company's first interns to a paid member of staff that created shows like Metal Gear Ben, Clip of the Week, and probably a bunch of other series trapped in the bogs of the Rooster Teeth archives. But there was one show Ben came up with that rose above them all and would stand the test of time to this very day. Like many nerds back then, and especially now, Ben had a fascination with debating which fictional characters would win in a fight, but he found it frustrating how pretty much every video focused on this topic never provided a clear-cut answer. But what if such a show existed that actually did? Combining this newfound drive with inspiration from shows like Deadliest Warrior and Animal Face-Off, Ben created a pilot for a brand new series to show off to Screw Attack, and that series was called Who Would Win? But then Evil Craig said that's fucking stupid and they changed it to Death Battle. Was the show a success? Well, considering the fact it got to the point where the entire YouTube channel was reformatted to focus solely on Death Battle and we're gradually approaching 200 episodes, I'll let you decide. My name is Nathaniel Rizzo, but you guys can just call me Nate. And I've been hired by our future overlord Raccoon Bro VA to help spread the good word of why Death Battle kicks all the ass. There are plenty of YouTube channels I thoroughly enjoy, but something about Death Battle hits entirely different for me when it comes to excitement. Ever since I got into the show as far back as Goomba vs. Koopa, I've always made it a point to be right there for the premiere of every new episode. Seeing the hard work of every animator, editor, researcher, writer, voice actor, and host come together is all kinds of inspiring. And with each episode having a completely unique tone and voice, there really aren't many shows that can quite compare to it in terms of variety. Sure, it could be hit or miss at times, especially for those peeps who get a bit too into the debate side of things. But at the end of the day, this show isn't just about finding out who punches the best. It's a creative outlet for artists from all over to collaborate and put their best foot forward on a show that has entertained as well as enraged millions. And to show how much I love this show and what it means to me, I want to take y'all on a journey throughout the years so we can see just how far it's come. And if the Nostalgia Critic has taught me anything, I'm sure the thing I loved as a kid will be just as entertaining now as it was back in the day. Well, that was certainly entertaining. Okay, so it's no secret by now that this show had a very different production pipeline compared to now. And by that I mean, there was no pipeline. While Ben technically wasn't doing everything by himself, he still had to animate every single fight on a bi-weekly basis while in film school. I don't care if they look crude nowadays, that shit is hard. There's a reason the show employs entire teams of artists now. And Ben was doing this on top of writing, voicing, editing, researching, so say goodbye to that sleep schedule. Eventually, they would finally bring in an experienced animator to handle the workload, and while it's pretty easy to tell where this jump happens, I still have this inescapable fondness for those early episodes. What can I say, it's charming as hell and brings you back to the old days of when the internet was the Wild West, and when I still had a shred of innocence to my name. Of course, Death Battle also destroyed that innocence, but it was bound to happen anyway. You'd be surprised by the things they teach you at church camp. So, what I'd like to do is go through every episode of the show, season by season, give my generalized thoughts on them, and then round off the whole thing by the end with a 10 words or less section and a summary of the season as a whole. But here's the humdinger. Instead of going through these boys from worst to best or vice versa, I'd like to do things a little differently and go in chronological order. That way we all can get a better idea of how the show evolved, and I can have an obligatory means of differentiating myself from Digital Ty. The hell? It's a win-win because I've decided it is. Ratings are based less on how accurate the results are and more so the entertainment value I get out of an episode. Though I will point out if the show's results make no sense even by their own logic. And while the fight animation takes precedence, I will also factor the analysis sections into my scores, depending on if they're really, really good or really, really cringe. But since this is season 1, I'll try not to hold these episodes up to modern standards too much. With all that exposition out of the way, I'd say it's high time we've begun our trek through the mountains of Death Battle's lush and rich history. And for our purposes, that means going all the way back to the episodes that started it all. Yes, I mean episodes, and yes, I mean all the way back.
What kind of budget are these guys working with?
Boba Fett versus Samus Aran. Ah, the one that started it all. It always feels so cozy coming back to this one. It's nice to know that there was in fact a time when the Screw Attack symbol had significance outside of Metroid. Ironic, isn't it? And we could all go, that was insane, after seeing this, I want to say animation? I love this show, don't get me wrong. I've recommended it to so many people. But unlike most series, this is one where watching the first episode, well, first is both optional and not exactly recommended. When watching these rundowns, it's pretty obvious that it was a lot more about geeking out over two fictional characters as opposed to Wizard and Boomstick. I say characters loosely because they sound like they're played by the same person trying to do two different voices. I mean shit, the way they both say death battle in this episode, you'd think Wizard is supposed to be the funny man of the group.
Well, it's time for a death battle. A death battle.
That's how I would say it. Just listen. Death battle. Who wore it better? Fight in the comments. That's the only debate I'll allow under this video. Since our hosts are so samey, it's basically just a bullet point list of their weapons and going, ooh, shiny, with the odd bit of sexism.
Someone get this chick a purse.
That wasn't an edit, by the way. That was the line they decided to close out Samus's analysis. Even the results end up mostly being a play-by-play of what we already saw, as if it was broadcast sports. And like I said, this battle is definitely animated. About as animated as me, anyway. Aside from the semi-interesting perspective change that Ben was really proud of at the time, there's really nothing to talk about here. Some back and forth, Samus rolls away, leaves a bomb, and freezes Boba tea. At least the title of the show wasn't lying. That's better than most YouTube videos at the time. There was in fact death in this battle. Fun fact, this episode, as well as the show as a whole, was inspired by Haloid, a Halo/Metroid/Dead or Alive animated fight by the late great Monty Oum. So it was only natural they'd want to make Samus their first fighter. And when it came to finding a different opponent, Boba Fett had more than 5 minutes of screen time in his movies. Sounds reasonable to me. Obviously, I'm not going to compare this episode to Haloid, but it goes without saying that the standards for animation, especially sprite animation, have gone way up over the years, in part thanks to this show. At the end of the day, Boba vs. Samus is best enjoyed as a fun time capsule that shows how far Death Battle has come in virtually every aspect. But if you really want to see how much this show has evolved, look no further than its concept pilot. I told you guys I meant episodes plural. It feels a little unfair to clown on this given it wasn't even supposed to be public originally, but I mean just look at this! Ben is hosting all by himself, we get Dragon Ball Z music instead of Invader, the background is just a photo of a lot near the office, and the show wasn't even called Death Battle yet! There's an alternate universe where this video's title is every episode of Who Would Win Season 1 reviewed in 10 words or less. Shit, with a name like that, who knows if they would have even gotten a whole season out? Or if I'd even have a job. It's also fun seeing how many things managed to stay consistent throughout all three versions, such as the Sarlacc pit and gun cradling jokes, as well as the fight choreography with arbitrary differences. Like how Boba's missile does no damage to Samus in the concept pilot, or Samus not even needing to dodge the flamethrower and just standing there like, really? This is the galaxy's greatest bounty hunter? Right before KOing him like it was Smash Brothers. Times may have changed, but damn if I still don't get a nostalgic kick out of this show's first outing. Besides, we've all got to start somewhere.
Your soul is mine.
Oh, please. I have no soul.
Akuma vs. Shang Tsung. Here's where things start to get interesting. Up to this point, Ben had viewed the fight animation more like a simulation, almost like watching a turn-based RPG battle play out, hence the health bars. I didn't mention it in the last entry, but this show used to have health bars during the fight, a tradition that lasted a long several weeks. Yeah, even back then it was obvious the health bars added very little to the overall experience, but at least the last episode they were used for was actually somewhat fitting given both fighters' origins. They'd even managed to play well into the dynamic these two had. Akuma immediately dominating, only to let his guard down to see if this new power set was a worthy challenge, is great at showing off his love for combat and Shang's trickery. The health bars get played around with even more with the Soul Steal move, but the real highlight of this fight happens after Shang pulls a Ditto and we get this out of nowhere climactic aerial bout. Sure, it's super crusty and pixely, but this is about as good as you could get back then with the only animation experience under your belt being these troublesome twins. And then we get the simultaneous super moves, and afterwards it's actually kind of suspenseful who won. Even the health bars don't give it away until the souls are let loose. For a second episode, this one was honestly way better than it had any right to be. The climax was so exciting that it inspired Ben to make the animations more fun and spectacle-y. The analysis portions still need a bit of work, though we do get the iconic finger painting joke, and there's clearly an attempt being made to differentiate our hosts a bit more.
I mean, Tsung loses to Liu Kang all the time, and compared to Akuma, Liu Kang's the nicest guy in the world.
At this rate, the show might just be hitting its stride sooner than we thought.
I'd be holding on to Miss Marvel for as long as I could. Plus then when she's unconscious,
Now you're making a joke!
Rogue versus Wonder Woman. I just had to do this thing in chronological order, didn't I? Well, better to rip the band-aid off sooner than later. Up to now, Death Battle, while not exactly good yet, has at least been cute and harmless. Odd words to describe a show called Death Battle, I realize, but it's clearly been all about nerds geeking out over pop culture and entertaining us with their crude production value. And hey, this episode does improve on one thing over the last two. The dynamic between Wiz and Boomstick is much better defined, but when it comes to the actual characteristics given to them, mostly with Boomstick,
even killing the Greek god of war Ares.
Hear that, Kratos? A chick beat you to it.
yeah, while the other episodes might get a pass for their charm, Rogue vs. 1D doesn't even have that luxury. Cause holy crap are these segments uncomfortable to sit through. I'm not gonna act like I'm offended or anything, but it's just such an obvious and unfunny route to take a character like Boomstick. And that kind of comedy was inescapable back in the day. Not every aspect of early online humor is fun to look back on. If you've ever wondered why female-centered episodes have a mixed reputation on this show, a lot of it traces back to this one. This was a side of Boomstick that took a while to subside, and while it eventually went away, this episode is without question the one most affected by it, something Ben and Chad have gone on record about plenty of times, and I'm very glad they've made Boomstick more likable over the years. The fight may be competent at conveying speed, but it's too much of an eyesore to get behind. These 1D sprites are abysmal, and the results do a poor job explaining how Rogue would be able to steal enough of 1D's powers to win fast enough before getting splattered over the pavement. Sure, the death is creative, but it's hard to even appreciate that when you know just how much BS is getting its rocks off to these smexy sprites. While technically it's on a similar level to Akuma vs. Shang, the rustic charm is non-existent, giving very little reason to ever want to go back to it. Luckily, 1D got some better episodes later, at least by default, considering the threshold.
Koopas! Goombas! Whatever those things are!
Goomba vs. Koopa. Ah, my old friend. The very first episode of the show I ever checked out. Being the massive Mario fan I was and still am, when I saw this pop up in my feed, I was naturally curious. And as far as introductory episodes go, it's both a great and not so great one to start with. It's great because it feels like at this point they finally figured out the chemistry between our hosts, to where this feels like the true early stages of the dynamic we know now. Their banter here is absolutely hilarious, like how Wiz will bring up certain factoids that initially excite Boomstick only to be kinda lame. A lot of this analysis is our hosts making fun of the characters for either being stupid or cowardly, and while normally I'd have a problem with this, it doesn't feel out of place here. At the end of the day, it's a joke episode, and they get that point across pretty well with the animation being really epic throughout, only for that tension to be undercut by a really funny anticlimax. But therein lies the episode's biggest downfall. It's only episode 4 of the show, and already we're getting a pretty big departure from the formula, such as it being the same series and ending in a tie. Even using the word formula at this point is dubious at best, since everyone's still trying to get their footing. That doesn't tarnish the episode itself, but it probably would have been better to wait a little longer before whipping it out. But this is the first episode to hit 1 million views on YouTube, so what do I know? Also, the fight suffers from minor pacing issues. Despite only being 2 minutes, it feels a lot longer with these lingering shots that could have been cut down on, like the opening and the cannonball run. Though I do really like the music choice in both scenes. Without a doubt, this one's on top as of now. And we'd even end up with a cool as hell rematch 10 whole years later that ups the ante when it comes to making this stupid ass matchup way cooler than it has any right to be, making it the only matchup to be a death battle first and then a DBX. The perfect nostalgic closure to my very first episode of the show. It may be stupid and a total cop-out, but I would expect nothing less. Anyone think we can get hashtag justice for Goomba trending, by the way? I don't care if he died first, he 100% had the killing blow. When will the mushroom injustice end?
Woo-hoo! Tough boys!
Haggar vs. Zangief. And just like that, Goomba vs. Koopa has already been dethroned. I guess the mushroom injustice is just an innate part of life. Damn. If I was to pick which is the best, earliest episode to start with in terms of familiarizing yourself with the show's format, I'd pick this one. At this point, the hosts' voices have been locked and loaded, and all it took was Ben saying, "That's right, Boomstick," for thousands of hours. And it'll be a little while until the next time they truly evolve, which isn't such a bad thing here, because they're good at running us through our fighters' mindsets, fighting styles, and where their rivalry comes from. The amount of fan content used, though, is definitely overabundant, and likely here due to how requested this fight was. But this episode even goes as far as taking a piece of fan art and treating it like an actual feat, which is the equivalent of blasphemy by today's standards. Luckily, it doesn't affect the outcome or the fight, which has some pretty great back and forth for the most part. Like, damn, these sprites aren't ugly as sin to look at, and it actually feels like they're clashing with each other during these scuffles. The grappling is pulled off well, and I like how when they use similar moves, the one who created it does a better job pulling it off. This episode's choreography is super fun, whenever it actually feels like showing it to us, that is. It's pretty lame how much takes place inside the building, with visual gags that really want to remind you what year this came out. If it was done today, we likely would have gotten some kind of montage as they slowly fight their way up each flight of stairs. Either way, it leads us to a genius set piece where our two muscle men's iconic pile drivers are put to the ultimate test of gravity. While it's light on choreography, it makes up for that intention, and I especially appreciate how you can catch who wins before the big reveal if you pay close enough attention. After that, we get one of our first instances of a host blatantly showing their bias. And here, it's a pretty fun way to expand Boomstick's character with how much he respects Haggar's sheer manhood. It was smart to do this for the loser, really getting the point across that bias does not play a part on this show. I'm sure people totally got the message and would never bring up bias ever again. Who's ready to have their childhoods ruined?
Hey, if it is my favorite client, what can I do you for, champ?
I just killed a lot of people.
What?
And I'm not even talking about bad guys, I mean just straight up innocent heroes, just outright slaughtered.
Okay.
Tmnt Battle Royale. Yet another idea that feels a bit early to be tackling, the Battle Royale. Though I'll give it a pass here since it's a relatively simple one on paper. My attachment to this franchise varies depending on the iteration, but just know that none of the ones I'm personally familiar with were presented here. Combine that with each analysis segment quickly rushing through each turtle and you get a rundown that's snoozing at best and blatantly offensive at worst. I'll admit, as a kid, I thought the bong joke was the funniest thing ever, but it's pretty accepted throughout the community that Mikey has bar none one of the worst rundowns in the show's history. Even ignoring certain insults getting thrown around, there's so much bad faith surrounding him. And the double standard of making fun of the nunchucks for being farming tools when the size are too is absurd. See what happens when you confront a guy with nunchucks and get back to me after that. I get wanting to rush things since it's more than 2 characters, but with how barren these segments are, you wouldn't even know that Ben binged through all of the TMNT shows at the time within less than 2 weeks. Although that might explain why the fight was so brutal. Methinks a little bit of rage needed to be expressed. Obviously, this show has gone to much darker places, and in a vacuum, the choreography here is decent, whenever you can make out shit from the blur. I definitely give props to the final bout with Leo versus Raph, and I can at least see what they were going for with the kill order, but when you know the familial bond these guys share outside of Death Battle, it's hard not to be a little sick to your stomach seeing moments like Leo emotionlessly decapitating his brother, or Raph stabbing Donnie 24 goddamn times. Wanting to find out the strongest turtle is all well and good, but considering the rules of this show specifically, it's important to accept that some Death Battle matchups just don't work on a conceptual level, at least when it comes to accurate character portrayal, which I'd argue is the most important part. It doesn't feel like I'm watching the actual Ninja Turtles, it's just gratuitous violence without the cheesy fun these characters are known for, which is probably why it's one of the few episodes to still be trapped in the dreaded copyright strike zone. One of these days it may rise from the depths yet again, much like our heroes, but I certainly won't be holding my breath. By the way, for those who haven't seen Mutant Mayhem, they say words like sus and riz throughout. So yeah, have fun with that knowledge.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
Zitz versus Leonardo. Hey, so fun fact, I know the Champions poll is a super big deal right now, but a lot of folks forget that it isn't the first time an episode has been decided by the fans. Ben always planned to have the TMNT winner appear in the next episode, but originally he wanted to use the White Ranger. After a couple peers suggested using a Battletoad, Ben put out a poll for the audience to decide which character the Royale winner would fight. So basically what I'm trying to say is, this is all your fault! Like, holy shit, and I thought the last fight was bare bones. Zitz was sort of decent, and I liked a bit of Wiz putting the ridiculous plot in layman's terms for Boomstick. But even though this was the perfect time to expand on his character, they somehow had even less to say about Leo this time. And the fight is pretty whatever. I like the sound design on Zitz's initial pummeling, and the atmosphere was alright in the sewer. But unlike Goomba versus Koopa, which felt a little padded, this one goes in one ear and out the other, taking an interesting concept of 2 episodes being connected and making it very forgettable in the long run. Though I do prefer this episode given Leo isn't brutally eviscerating his family this time. While it's still not super in character for these two to kill each other from what I know, it's at least easier to suspend your disbelief when that initial connection is no longer present. It's no wonder most people forget about this fight. It's the shortest animation in the whole series. Well, at least it would be.
That was it?
Yoshi vs. Riptor. It could just be my bias towards Mario kicking in yet again, but I really don't mind this episode as much as others. It's got obvious problems, but in spite of the short script, these rundowns felt fairly complete. Both of their origins were fairly well established, and we get a great combination of ability rundown and comedy. The baby launcher bit is a classic, and made particularly funny due to Wiz's response being more concerned with the logistics as opposed to morality. Boomstick's dinosaur spiel is also significant, as it's one of the few times he isn't coming in with one-liners, and spends a solid amount of time on facts since he loves geeking out about dinosaurs, a phase almost every little boy can attest to. I'd probably give this episode a much higher rating if it weren't for the fight being about as nothing as the last one, only this time a majority of the combat is Yoshi running away and Riptor no-selling the hits right up until the very last second. I get that this moment is a reference to the Killer Instinct ringouts, but after how much love was given to Yoshi in the analysis portion, it felt like hardly any of that love carried over here for the sake of comedy. After all, we gotta go all out with the cutesy, child-friendly character fighting the violent, more scary-looking character. It's a shame how little faith this animation has in Yoshi as a fighter, despite the fact that he ultimately wins. Makes his victory feel unearned when it really shouldn't be if you know how powerful these two universes actually are. I'm not asking for Yoshi to dominate the whole time, obviously, but a longer runtime definitely would have allowed for more interesting back and forth, making this a not-so-good fight that gets almost saved by the fun analysis, until you remember they also used Smash and Mario Kart as arguments for Yoshi winning. Let's give it up for the continuity win when Boomstick brings up his kitten cannon before the ad break. The Boomstick's launcher arc is one we can all get behind. Felicia vs. taokaka. Oh hey, an episode where calling it a catfight actually works as a joke with a double meaning. Too bad Boomstick already used up the catfight comment in the other one. But in terms of female-led fights, comparing this to the last one is like night and day. It takes the time here to get across their personalities and how their biologies and upbringings play into their fighting styles. Though this is a female-led fight in Season 1, so it's not without its weird bits. We give a lot of shit to Wiz for some of his sus comments these days, and rightfully so, but how quickly we seem to forget the time Boomstick almost pulled a Shane Dawson. The animation ain't too shabby and really leans into the fighter's fighting game origins with the flashy combos. What really helps this one stand out though is how prevalent their personalities are, which especially goes a long way during a time where the fight was mostly just there to showcase out-of-context brutality. I like the small butterfly interruption, and while the up-close back and forth got old, it leads to a funny subversion where taokaka is slashing wildly at the air before getting caught off guard. This is followed by a pretty cool moment of taokaka using her agility to get in close and land a sick finishing blow. Despite getting the KO graphic though, we still get a short-lived celebration from Tao, making her one of the few combatants to say something after the KO announcement. But then we get to the episode's major downfall of the ending results. It's 5 sentences long, and that includes Wiz announcing the winner. Even by the standards of this era, that is way too short. Supposedly, it's really close, but all we get for Tao is better agility and saw blades. That agility was shown off, to be fair, but I don't see why it had to be so rushed. It's like they weren't confident in their own reasoning. This episode's biggest strength is getting the characters' personalities down cat. It's definitely flawed, but I honestly feel bad for not giving this one enough credit at the time of its release. Blaze Blue, until we meet again in the next video. As for you, Darkstalkers, see ya in 9 years, bitch!
The consecrated oil, wax from the sacred candles, and this
is just a fucking gun.
Kratos versus Spawn. Yeesh, talk about unfortunate timing. Every now and then, there'll be a legacy matchup that could have easily been done at any point in the show, but you're thankful they waited so that the production value could help match the scope. Then on the other hand, you've got overly ambitious ones that are simply too big for the early era format. And hey, with the given time constraints, I'm impressed with how much they were able to pack in as they did. Kratos and Spawn's analyses could have easily been treated like weapon and ability checklists. While there certainly were sections dedicated to this, it wasn't the whole focus and was meant to get the ridiculous breadth of powers across. I know Chad isn't a big fan of his early Boomstick voice, but I've gotta give props to him for the comedic delivery on that Nana line.
That looks like my Nana. My demigod.
As for the fight, it certainly is a 2011 sprite fight featuring Kratos and Spawn trying to pack in as much shit as it can in less than 80 seconds. The animation is fine, it's just a fundamental issue. The best early episodes tend to focus on very simple, low-stakes characters. These two were way too big for Death Battle's britches. It's why they're two of the most campaigned characters to get a modern run back. Kratos and Spawn would be able to kick all kinds of ass today. And it's not like the episode is without cool concepts, like their weapon synergy and the oh shit feeling when Kratos Kratos busts out the Olympus blade, but the cool build-up doesn't excuse that little head slish of a death. No wonder God of War fans complained. That was lame. Funny how they said none of Kratos' weapons could kill Spawn except the Olympus blade, claim it wasn't enough, and then proceed to not elaborate. The day these two return will be glorious, but until then, you did your best, guys.
Huh? What's in it?
Bomberman vs. Dig Dug. Now here we have a complete opposite to the last episode in everything but art style and length. But where that was something to hold Kratos vs. Spawn back, here it pretty much enhances the experience. The analysis portions are stellar by Season 1 standards. Most of the jokes are super solid, such as the Act 0 jab, listing the stuff Bomberman would blow up, and Dig Dug's feet. Oh, calm down, they're literally just pixels. Some of the comedy comes from simply describing both of their games at face value and how deceptively gruesome they are despite the cute aesthetic, which leads to a funny end clip timing on Bomberman's end in particular. While the fight is still short, it was pretty much as long as it needed to be. These are two very straightforward characters, and I'm honestly impressed Ben was able to squeeze out as much choreography as he could. I know this is one of the most talked about episodes when it comes to characters being downplayed, and I certainly don't blame salty Bomberman fans when the only reason Dig Dug won was because of maneuverability. Personally, I'm not too miffed by it, for one reason alone. That gut-busting death. The comedic timing is beautiful. I have no idea where that scream comes from, but holy cow was it the perfect choice, and it gets me every time. A simple dynamic like this was just the thing early Death Battle needed, and it's one of the few matchups I can't see working today. Not just because of scaling shenanigans. It's a cozy episode that I'd revisit anytime. And if you love this episode too, don't be afraid to say it. Sometimes simple is the best way to go.
Sayonara.
That's Japanese for goodbye.
Vegeta vs. Shadow. Here we have a pretty big milestone episode when it comes to the trickling impact it had on the show. Not only is it the first Dragon Ball and Sonic episode, God help us later on, it's the first one to use voice acting. And once the series started getting more ambitious, this was an absolutely necessary addition for telling more compelling stories and fleshing out the characters in a way that voice clips alone would be very limited at. The analysis is alright. The main thing that stuck out to me was the shadow falling on someone bit, mainly because you can hear Chad clapping his hands in the booth, which I like to visualize.
Some guy just walking along there. Oh my God!
Needless to say, they go a lot more in depth later on when it comes to both franchises. Clocking in at a little over 3 minutes, this is by far our chonkiest animation yet. Not because of any intricate choreography or set pieces, mind you. It's pretty easy to tell that Ben and Chad were very excited by the prospect of hiring actual acting talent for the first time and wanted to utilize Team 4-Star as much as possible. And I certainly don't blame them. TFS was well established at this point when it came to their comedic chops.
Really showed that Team 3-Star spirit.
I'll never find your body.
And this episode even helped introduce me to them as a channel, which I'm very thankful for. And given they got the voice actors for Vegeta and Nappa,
you're a little on the short side to try to be threatening. Funny. I was going to say the same thing about you. You've just sealed your fate, fool.
They already have a lot of chemistry going into this fight. Unfortunately, Curtis does not use the Nappa voice for Shadow. I'm not saying it'd fit, but if you're gonna give a purposely bad performance, you might as well go all out. So yeah, ironically, the action in our first Dragon Ball episode is kind of an afterthought compared to the banter, and these character portrayals definitely have more of an abridged flavor to them, which might be a turnoff for purists. I'll admit, the banter is very well written, and there are tons of moments that have gone down in the Death Battle Hall of Fame, like the rip-off line, Shadow throwing Vegeta's height insult back at him, and of course, Sayonara being one of the funniest deaths on the channel to this day. And the episode doesn't lack set pieces. It's our first time going to space, and we hadn't seen anything like the moon punch yet.
That's a cool JPEG.
Your enjoyment of this episode ultimately comes down to if you find the dialogue funny and can tolerate the minimal action. And while I still enjoy the episode, I'll admit that Death Battle has gotten much better at balancing fun banter with awesome fight scenes. Plus, these two would eventually get runbacks that are much more action-oriented anyway. So if anything, the comedic tone helps this episode stand out much more in retrospect. It's also cool seeing how much everyone's voice acting on the show has grown, not just Ben and Chad. Even Nick needed to fine-tune his Vegeta voice a bit before getting to the bone-chilling cries we know today. As for Curtis as Shadow, boy, that perfect self performance sure is great, huh?
I hate
Mushrooms.
Mario vs. Sonic. Putting aside the fact this is our second Sonic episode in a row, here is a matchup that everyone and their grandmother who has unexpected knowledge of video games was waiting to see the show do. And despite it being another big for their britches kind of matchup, it really felt like they were up to the challenge this time and were simply excited to be doing it. And it helps that they have more accessible sprites this time around. These analysis segments ooze passion. It's awesome to see so many of their powers discussed, and instead of non sequitur endings, we get actual tributes to Mario and Sonic as heroes. They may only be a sentence long, but it goes a long way in making the analysis segments feel more complete, something most episodes up to this point had been missing. And this is the closest we've gotten so far to the standards of more modern episodes when it comes to showing off not just the fighters' arsenals, but also their legacy and why we love them as characters. The animation is great at reflecting this passion and how it is in fact a big rivalry being put through the gauntlet. Even little things like Sonic acknowledging his and Mario's history in spite of the rules helps get across the significance of this showdown. You could tell Ben knew a lot was riding on this one and tried to stuff this bad boy to the brim with as many iconic abilities as he could, which is especially good since the whole crux of Sonic winning is the idea that Mario would eventually blow through all of his power-ups. So seeing so much on screen helps get the war of attrition across. What I really appreciate is that even though the action is being given a lot more focus, the battle isn't without charm and silly moments that feel right at home in their series. But as much as I adore the first half for having so much going on and a great balance of tone, the second half loses its steam just a little bit. The water section is certainly a tense moment, but it also dampens the pacing. And while I love that supersonic transformation, I'm not as big a fan of the choreography here compared to earlier. Mario switches between power-ups to withstand supersonic, and the back and forth just isn't that interesting to me. Probably because Mario doesn't get phased by any of the attacks, whereas supersonic is largely ineffective. And then base Sonic simply outruns Mario and wins suddenly, which to their credit is reflective of the results. Though I'm not sure what this animation here was supposed to get across. Like, since when does Mario get dizzy after powering down? And if it's him realizing he has no more power-ups, it does not read that way. It's worth noting that this was my second ever episode of the show. Don't ask me what my third was, I don't remember. And no amount of Koopa incineration could have prepared me for that death. As a 10-year-old Mario fan, it was horrifying. This stock blood splatter haunted my dreams. I was a sheltered kid, alright. Nowadays, it's not bad, but it definitely feels like another, oh balls, the animation is getting too long, we need to wrap this shit up. I wouldn't be surprised if part of the reason the second half feels disjointed in comparison to the first is cause Sonic talks a lot more. And as we've already established, Ben and Chad were still finding their footing in regards to implementing custom voice acting. And Kate and Red Pearl does alright as our blue blur.
So you're a bit tougher than I thought, huh? But now it's time for me to finish this. Whoa.
I have a lot of respect for this episode and how much it was able to pull off at such an early time period. In spite of my gripes, it's unquestionably the best episode we've gotten so far. And that's due in no small part to its ambition and my own nostalgic attachment to it. And considering how focused ScrewAttack was on video games at the time, you could tell that they wanted this episode in particular to be a crowd pleaser. For the most part, at least. I have no doubt that Mario vs. Sonic helped lay the groundwork of what Death Battle would eventually become at an early stage in its life. And I'm excited to see how they continue to step things up from here. Now let's see what's next.
It's the Justin Bieber Show.
I'm not even selling shirts!
No.
You are the chosen one! It was sent you to destroy the Sith, not join them! What the fuck are you talking about?
Harry Potter versus Luke Skywalker. Okay, I know I shouldn't since I've already done it twice, but I'm seriously tempted to give myself another pass. Let's just make this quick. Okay, first of all, what the hell is this connection?
Every generation has idolized a sci-fi hero.
Sci-fi? Harry Potter believes in about as much science as Mac from It's Always Sunny.
Bitch!
Though, knowing J.K. Rowling, I wouldn't put it past her to retroactively say all spells in the world came from chemistry. The analysis is whatever, but holy crap is this animation dull. And I thought Kratos vs. Spawn was a bad fit for Season 1. If these were the only sprites available at the time, I straight up would have just scrapped the episode. It is not worth the time and effort if it's gonna look like this. Gotta love when character portrayal feels one-sided because only one of them has voice clips being used, with said voice clips coming from Chad himself, and while the thought of Boomstick as Harry fucking Potter is hilarious, it's at least a better performance than Raccoon Bro as Aizen. Boom. Luke has no presence because of this, but even then he's still treated better character-wise than Harry, whose go-to strategy here seems to be spamming spells willy-nilly as well as leading with the killing one. Are we sure this is the boy who lived or a 9-year-old playing Call of Duty? I will give the episode 1 point in that the death is actually pretty sick. If you thought Mario vs. Sonic's death was traumatizing to me as a kid, oh boy, we all gotta grow up somehow. Overall, this episode is snoozing and visually unappealing all around. A Luke Skywalker runback would go hard today given how awesome modern Star Wars episodes are. As for bringing Harry Potter back, I'm fine with waiting.
Boobs. It's the I like the boobs more. I just realized.
Chun-li versus my Shiranui. Oh hey, the episode where the best aspect of it is unironically the ad break. Yay! So as I'm sure you all can expect, this episode once again is focused on horny boomstick. But I'll give credit where it's due. Considering Chun-li's fighting style being largely focused around her legs, and yeah, it at least makes a bit more sense than Rogue versus Wonder Woman to focus on their bodies here. I mean, it's still annoying, but at least it's only mildly uncomfortable this time. Look, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm above crushing over video game characters, especially the Street Fighter cast. Jerry, my beloved. And thanks to the most replayed feature on YouTube, I've caught the general death battle audience red-handed. You guys are so busted. But there's a time and a place for that kind of humor. When done to an absurd enough degree, it could be a riot. And it's usually at its funniest when the person being pervy gets comeuppance or at least general annoyance from other characters, which we don't get enough of here. Felicia versus taokaka may have that moment, but at least it's quick and Wiz immediately shuts his co-host down. It'd be one thing if it was just a passing comment or two. I even like the distraction gag quite a bit, but the analysis segments are about hyping these characters up and why they're awesome. So the whole objectification aspect throughout kind of flies in the face of that sentiment. Not helping is that the fight itself is aggressively boring and does little to utilize these characters' strengths. The wall climb part is kinda cool thanks to the environment usage, but before anything has a chance to settle, the death comes out of nowhere and it's just over. Goomba versus Koopa has more fanfare than this. And that was a joke episode. But hey, at least that ad break is so good that it actually gives this episode an extra point on my rating system. Take that as you will.
Hey guys, look, it's me, Rainbow Dash!
Oh, look, it's Rainbow Dash.
Starscream versus Rainbow Dash. Oh, I've been excited to get to this one. One of the most hated episodes of Season 1, and now I finally get to detail everything wrong with this garbage. So, my connections to Transformers are virtually non-existent. My Little Pony, on the other hand, I've seen every episode, special, movie. In fact, it was this episode that sparked my interest in MLP. Oh, right, back to why this episode sucks. On the Transformers side of things, a good chunk is spent on how lame Starscream is, which, I mean, honestly, that's fitting. The dude seems like kind of a prick. But then you've got Dashes where Boomstick actively groans at the franchise until he eventually comes around and realizes she's pretty cool, which mirrors how this episode came about when they were originally going to make Starscream versus Twilight Sparkle until they looked into Dashie and saw how ridiculous her powers are. But that fight though, Starscream is bullied throughout and barely gets any hits in, which feels accurate given the version they're using and leads to some pretty fun comedic chemistry. Fuck, I think I like this episode, guys. Look, I totally get why this one is hated, especially when you know the context that it wouldn't exist if Rainbow Dash lost, implying that Starscream was set up for failure. It could just be because of my indifference to Transformers, but I still enjoy what this episode has to offer on the surface. The action is consistently fun, the stuff in the sky is exciting, even the Sonic Rain Boom is well presented given the time it came out. The thing that truly keeps me coming back though is the banter. This is the first time an episode with voice acting has been able to be funny while not having to compromise the action, at least in my opinion. Zach Wilson voiced Starscream and then proceeded to drop off the face of the earth. Yo, Zach, if you're somehow watching this wherever you are, your one IMDb credit still holds up, my friend. He transitions from cockiness to frustration seamlessly, and that deceitful nature makes him so punchable in the best way. Also, apparently the Spark is voiced by Jim Sterling. I don't know why, but hey, good for you.
Pony, I'll crush you in an instant. Prepare to be annihilated. I am going to kill you.
Tag, you're it.
Yeah!
But what's really interesting is that Dash's VA, Erica Mendez, has gone from this episode to being practically everywhere. It's surreal seeing the start of someone's career who's become such a pillar in the voiceover world. And even back in her more green years, she still does a great job at capturing Dash's personality.
Aw yeah, that was awesome. All right, it is on.
What's funny about this is that even though Erica would go on to do grander things, current Death Battle has gotten big enough to the point where bringing her on for a hypothetical Rainbow Dash run back is totally plausible. I'd honestly love to see how she'd approach the character nowadays. Pardon my tangent, the point is, this episode has a fun dynamic, great voice acting, varied set pieces, and while the cynicism from Boomstick in regards to ponies does get tiring later on, I think it's perfectly acceptable for the first time they cover MLP. I'll admit, the ending is very dubious since one of the rules is that a fight can't end until there's death, and Starscream's spark is supposedly indestructible. They'd even go on to drive this point home further with a Q&A session. So by that logic, why was Goomba versus Koopa a stalemate and not this? But that's basically my one main issue with the episode. I totally understand if you don't like the one-sided nature of it. Starscream gets like 2 hits in, and the whole unexpectedly OP cartoon character washing the lamest iteration of a normally imposing character concept would be done better later on. But like I said, I thought the dynamic was really funny. I don't mind seeing a character like Starscream get bullied, and I could totally buy Rainbow Dash wanting to fuck with this demented doofus.
Bastards! Hey, what are you doing? Stop that!
Plus, it's not like she was in no danger at all. You could hear the fear in her voice during that final missile barrage, and she had to act quickly to survive. And the whole reason that happened in the first place was because of Starscream's silver tongue. Bottom line, I'm weird, my tastes are weird, the pony episode is my favorite of season 1 so far. Not sorry. Oh, also, there's a remastered version on Rooster Teeth. It uses a couple different clips and makes some minor changes to the sprites. And you need a first membership if you don't want ads. Yeah, just stick to the YouTube version, you'll live.
Where were you planning on shooting him from? The fucking moon? If you'd have backed up any further, you'd have had to mail him the bullets.
Master Chief versus Doomguy. A bittersweet entry this time as it's our last hurrah with Revision 3, one of the streaming services for early Death Battle that would later go defunct in 2017. I may not know much about you guys and pretty much exclusively associate you with that kid pulling off a gnarly kickflip, but I won't deny that you guys still left an impression on me as a kid. Was their last episode a proper send-off? Master Chief's analysis is whatever and basically just listing off weapons without going into the story. Meanwhile, Doomguy got so much preferential treatment here, it's unfair. Even though it's mostly listing off weapons again, our hosts, especially Boomstick, sound much more hyped listing everything out. Yet another moment of co-host bias that shows off their values. And I love seeing him get more and more excited as the destructive capability increases. Maybe a little too excited.
And the unprecedented range of its splash damage ensures no one's getting away unscathed.
See, there is a way to make horny Boomstick funny, if it's for a gun. And while brief, we get a much better understanding of Doomguy's story and why he's awesome. The most I got excited watching Chief's segment was seeing Red vs. Blue show up. Now for the fight, and it's such a victim of its time. Chief's sprites honestly aren't that bad and are utilized pretty well for fancy movement. Meanwhile, Doomguy's crusty ass has like 5 frames of walking animation, and by walking, I mean trudging. God, he is so slow! They said he can outrun his own bullets, yet here he can't even be bothered to do a hop. I guess they were going for a sort of Terminator thing to make Guy seem more imposing, but not only is it weird that he take his time like this to get to Chief even when invincible, it flies in the face of how his games are played. And when the personality of a fighter is minimal, you better at least translate how it feels to play as them on screen. Now, the amount of weapons showcased is commendable, and it's really cool seeing them bounce off each other. I like how they said Guy can see invisible enemies and was able to spot out Chief immediately. And the death was an effective fake out with a few layers of comedy as the grenade makes this little hit sound, Guy is confused, we get this hilarious scream, and Chief comes in for the true kill. Even if it's out of character, I'll allow moments like this when they're staples of the franchise. Oh hey, we also get a comparison page for the first time in the show. And thank God, because the ending analysis is almost always the flimsiest part of these early episodes, and it goes a long way in showing off the hard work that goes into research. Chief versus Guy is a weird one for me. It parallels Kratos versus Spawn in that it came out at a bad time in terms of what was available production-wise. While I think it's good overall, I won't deny that there's a lot holding this matchup back from what it was meant to be. While it's not like these characters could never work in sprites, not these ones at least, there's a reason why this is the one big episode left that people are campaigning to get a remake for. Not because it's one of the worst episodes, I doubt anybody needs to see 1D fight Rogue again. Not even necessarily the research. No, I still don't care if he's universal, I like it. But because we know the potential this matchup has when it comes to achieving greatness. Characters like Spidey and Spawn arguably need a run back more, but those would be for different opponents. This is the only Season 1 episode I can think of that is ripe for the squeezing out of fun, badass, preferably 3D goodness. Or just have one of them fight Samus, I'm not picky. Then again, we could make a 3-way out of this. Wait, no, I meant fight. I meant three-way fight!
Say it, you won't.
Eggman vs. Wily. Here it is, folks, the very last episode of Ben's animation career. And holy shit, what a way to go out! Analysis segments are good. This is the second time Boomstick makes a PETA joke in a Sonic episode.
He's PETA's worst nightmare.
Well, at least Eggman keeps his kidnapped animals alive. Boom! Also, referring to Eggman's different incarnations as a personality disorder is certainly one way to interpret it. Both segments follow a similar structure of the Doctor's backstory, their infantry, the big bads, the biggest bad, and how they fight themselves. The brilliant part is that basically everything mentioned in the analysis shows up in the animation. So while it's only a fraction of their armies, it still feels like we're getting everything we were promised. Not that Ben needed to animate literally every robot master, cause this thing is big enough as is. Did I mention this is the last animation that Ben has ever made? I didn't need to, because if you've been following everything closely up to now, this whole thing has major leave everything out on the table energy. It's an army sprite fight from 2011, and it's somehow still really cool. The effects aren't the fanciest, but we still get a good sense of how both armies synergize without things feeling cluttered. The coolness factor rises every time a new challenger approaches. I love the use of that target confirmed voice clip. I like how the robot masters immediately throw a wrench in things because of superior teamwork, until the oh-so-epic arrival of Metal Sonic. The intense music and change in tone lets you know things just got real. And one thing I didn't notice as a kid was how Metal's explosive came directly from copying Napalm Man, which is great for making us understand right away what makes him so dangerous compared to everyone else. And as the fight goes on, it's so cool seeing him systematically take every one of Wily's masters down. Another little detail I didn't notice as a kid was the sprite change after Metal powers up. So before, I was just like, what was the point of any of that? You may have noticed that I've been talking a lot about Metal, which is a little weird when it's Eggman versus Wily, so I definitely appreciate the brief scuffle these two have to remind us that this is in fact Eggman versus Wily still. That's kind of inevitable when the focus is on their armies, but herein lies this episode's Achilles heel. Metal goes overlord and absolutely decimates everything. But then he's just declared the winner. And even when I was younger, this felt pretty anticlimactic to me. Especially when if you look at their comparison sheets, you'd think the team would have deemed Wily the winner, not just using this very specific circumstance to pull a fast one on us. There are a few other things that nag at me, like this line coming from Base being weird. In fact, Base in general gets way less to do in comparison to Metal. This episode also has very selective voice acting. Caden Red Pearl is back as Eggman in Metal, and I never would have guessed that based on his previous performance. We wouldn't get another instance of voice actor plays hero and then two of that hero's villains afterwards until Nicholas Andrew Louis. Makes it all the weirder that this guy is nowhere else to be found. Show yourself, damn it, so I can compliment you.
Sucker! Kneel before your master.
And Wily's voice actor doesn't exist. Not even any recycled audio. Unless it's a very specific circumstance, I really don't like when one character gets a voice actor and the other doesn't. Even then, Eggman still gets text boxes like Wily, and the text doesn't even match up with what Caden is saying.
Call in the Egg Fleet!
That's not what the text said. I read it.
What is this, a visual novel? I've got to say though, I'm really glad I formatted the video in this way, cause seeing literally the entirety of Ben's animation portfolio and how it's evolved is cool as hell. It's even helped open my eyes a bit to what it must have been like for him having to juggle all these different jobs at once with such a tight schedule. And I can't emphasize how admirable the scope of this fight is enough. There's a reason we haven't gotten a true army battle like this one again. The closest is battle royales, and even when armies are involved, it still focuses for the most part on the two main combatants. I may have had some nitpicks, but I'm so happy Ben's last sprite fight was by far his best. It was 100% the right thing to start hiring experienced animators so that the show could continue to evolve, as well as for the sake of Ben's mental health. But I'll always look back on his episodes fondly, crusty pixels and all. That being said, it's finally time to start ushering in a new era.
Adam, what would you wish for in the wishing room?
A princess, a pretty princess.
Zelda vs. Peach. Out of all the episodes on this list, I have by far the rockiest relationship with this one. When it first came out, I despised it since I really liked Zelda and hated seeing Peach kill her, who had a massive hate wagon at the time that I loved riding. I know that sounds counterintuitive as a Mario fan, but I was also a little boy who hated any Disney movie with a princess. I had some growing up to do, but I still had a crush on Skyward Sword Zelda. I wasn't that cringy. Several years later, I matured and saw the good qualities in both princesses. weaknesses. Even if someone doesn't always fight directly, that doesn't make them worthless. And that newfound appreciation combined with the animation made me love this episode. Then we get to now. I was eagerly looking forward to rewatching this one after so long. This is probably because I've started factoring the analysis portions a lot more over the years when judging episodes, but Jesus, I completely forgot how much this episode fucking hates Peach and Zelda. A majority of their analysis segments are spent making fun of them for being useless. And while it's not as sexist as this season's worst, it still throws in sprinkles of it, calling them control freaks, manipulators, helpless, and ostracizing them for not grabbing their heroes' destinies. A joke that pretty much every video game parody made back in the day. It'd be one thing if this was a rap battle, but for Death Battle, where the whole point is celebrating these characters, it's fucking obnoxious. The damn first line calls them two of the most worthless damsels in distress. Like, chill, bro, we just sat down. The animation doesn't do these too many favors either when it comes to sprites. I can't even tell where Zelda's face starts and ends. If this was, say, the 5th episode of the show or something, it'd be terrible. But because they waited until now, there are several advantages that keep this episode out of the red. It may be a mess, but Peach's analysis still has some great jokes. That entire Vibe Scepter bit went over my head as a kid, and by the time I did understand the innuendos, that shot this episode into my top 5 of the season all on its own. At the time, at least. Mainly because I see it less as a sex joke, and more so pointing out Super Princess Peach's weird concept and Boomstick's immaturity. I also still like this butt explosion transition. But the secret weapon of this episode is the new animation talent, Mr. Lang. And for a first outing, he fucking delivers. The momentum is non-stop, the dynamic camera is a godsend for this show, and even if it's not the best visually, it's the sound design that really helps these fast-paced combos and transformations feel impactful. I've always loved imagining fight scenes, and that flurry of punches plays in my head every time. And out loud on occasion, I tend to get strange looks. And ignoring the batshit insane pseudoscience explaining it, I still love the killing blow from an animation standpoint. Unlike other quick deaths, it still has enough impact to leave an impression on you as big as Zelda's fucking brains. We've officially gotten to a point where even if the analysis is flawed, oh, who am I kidding? It fucking sucks. An episode can still be carried by the fight spectacle. And things are only gonna turn up from here. He says, knowing the coming trials ahead of him but still wanting to remain delusionally positive.
I must consult with the Elder Gods.
You're fucked.
Thor vs. Raiden. On the subject of fight animations carrying, this one has a pretty good analysis, highlights including Boomstick's Mjolnir arc and comparing the fighters to their mythological counterparts. But for the fight, Lang took what I love about his previous animation and ups the ante to meteoric proportions. If I had to describe this fight in a word, it'd be extra. Every little action these lightning boys take is so freaking extra. All Thor had to do was throw a tree, but the episode puts so much emphasis on the uprooting and its trajectory towards Raiden. Thor could have tossed the tree, but he chooses to punch it. Raiden could have teleported away or even stepped to the side, but chooses to obliterate it. This single interaction has more impact than some planetary explosions in later episodes, and that was just a tree! While their personalities don't get to shine that much, the character animation is very clever at differentiating them and tying into the results. Raiden is more martial arts savvy and styles on Thor with lightning-quick combos and teleport spamming to throw him off, whilst Thor is more about brute strength and only needs a handful of hits to do just as much damage. Both of their hits feel just as meaty in the sound design department. Mjolnir is one of my favorite weapons in fiction for this very reason. I love the crunch on the lightning attacks and the oomph on this drop kick. Even though the environment is a barren wasteland, it's still used to full effect. I've already mentioned the Giving Tree, and the mountains give us one of the funniest looking parts of the fight where Raiden recovers from that WWE SmackDown by running for his life. Just look at that little fucker go. How can you not be endeared? The camera is great at utilizing the 3D environment for even more dynamic shots than before. It's even used for little things like hiding the Mjolnir sprite on Thor's hand whenever he throws it, which is great for a time when customizing sprites wasn't the norm yet. Both art styles obviously clash, but I love how the choreography takes huge advantage of Raiden's digitized sprites for big moments you just didn't see back then. But the best set piece comes in when Thor summons the storm. The music becomes more dramatic, and the back and forth is so exhilarating it's unclear who'd win. Oh. Suffice to say, this is easily one of the biggest stomps in Versus show history. We'd get bigger ones later on, but this is basically the granddaddy of them all and the go-to example. Because unlike other stomps in Season 1, this is still really good. Both fighters are presented in equally over-the-top ways fitting to their fighting styles, and even as a kid, this was one of my most rewatched episodes. With all that extraness, it's no wonder it still holds up today. Oh yeah, this is also another milestone episode since it's our first dip in the sun kill. Again, extremely extra on Thor's part considering the lopsidedness, and I have to disagree with Boomstick, I didn't like it. I loved it.
He's got a sword!
Link versus Cloud. Man, and I thought Mario versus Sonic was an iconic fight. I may have liked Zelda as a kid, but I don't think it really clicked with me just how important these two characters are to the history of video games, and it's nice to see them treated as such. The analysis may have some problems like the arbitrary rule set they came up with of limiting their arsenals to non-canon fighting games, but I still like the rundowns quite a bit. They do make fun of the characters, but those felt more like playful roasts. They still feel properly revered as icons. For every emo comment Boomstick makes, he also gushes over how differently Cloud is built, and the fairy running gag has an effective payoff. I know I used milestone to describe the last episode very loosely, but this time it actually applies. The first episode of the show to not have a Boomstick pun. Like, come on, don't tell me this was supposed to be an innuendo of some kind. Was Boomstick feeling out of it that day or what? Guess the divorce was rougher than we thought. Oh, right. What I meant is this was the first episode to say winner in the victory screen instead of the fighter's name. Okay, I'll bite. It's the first 3D episode. Visually, not that hard to imagine, but in motion, for a first 3D episode, this was such a great outing. When introducing new ideas, your first use of it doesn't necessarily have to be the best, but it should at least do a good job laying the groundwork and getting audiences excited for the potential. And this wasn't even supposed to be 3D. Lang wanted to try it out for the sake of it and caught Ben and Chad off guard just as much as us. This choreography goes hard. Despite the episode limiting itself on items and magic, we still get some fun uses of their weapons to break up the straightforward yet surprisingly engaging swordplay. It's not the most complex animation, but the characters are so snappy and flippy-dippy with their moves it's hard to look away. The use of Zelda and Final Fantasy music is always a plus, of course, and I love hearing the sound of these swords clashing. Even when the sound design gets all warped in the middle, it's so in your face and gets you hyped for the soundtrack change. As if it's yelling, "Pay attention, this shit is just getting started." A lot of my enjoyment of this episode comes down to me being a big Zelda fan who is easily impressed by dumb fun sword duels. This fight falls apart when you study the choreography for too long. Like this boomerang bit is supposed to be a big gotcha moment, even though Link throwing it in the first place is basically what got him disarmed, and when it does come back to hit Cloud, he's so shaken up by this toy getting the better of him, he lets Link very slowly get his sword back. I think they were going for a sort of stun effect since that's what the boomerang does in the game. An idle animation that was definitely not in the budget for this secretly 3D fight. But you don't think about it too much in the moment because of how quick the pacing is, which has massively benefited this fight's staying power. And as dumb as it is to include Z targeting as an actual power for Link, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't implemented in the fight in a really cool way where Link has to try and block every strike from Cloud's strongest move before finally finding an opening. Funny how everyone complained about them giving Cloud his weakest weapons despite the fact that he's clearly using Omni-Slash version 5 here, a move that's not available for the Buster Sword. Wow, it's almost like the animation is mostly for fun, and isn't meant to be a perfect one-to-one reflection of the research. That being said, I'm still very glad this episode was given the remake it deserved. I mean, this match is so iconic, you could do it every 5 years and it'd still be relevant. While it lacks more in-depth use of their arsenals and facial expressions that aren't made from cardboard, it makes up for that with its non-stop momentum. And I just love this episode for what it is. A flawed yet exciting landmark in the show's history that had paved the way for some of Death Battle's greatest episodes of all time. But nothing will ever top that faceplant.
And it's a no on the cape.
I think it's cool.
Take that off, it's disrespectful. Spider-Man doesn't wear a cape.
Batman versus Spider-Man. Why does Peter have a hyphen in his name? Or should I be asking why Bruce doesn't? Much like Zelda versus Peach. Okay, Ben's right, it absolutely should have been called Peach versus Zelda. Batman versus Spider-Man is another episode I keep changing my feelings toward. There was a time when I wasn't the biggest fan of it, which I'll get to when I cover the fight. It's our first Marvel versus... It's our first Marvel versus... It's our first Marvel vs. DC episode, and despite the limited time, these analyses weren't too bad at covering the bases. The final line for Batman summarizes the character to a T. They listed him never using firearms as a feat. Once again, hindsight never ceases to be amusing. It's Peter's analysis I especially enjoy because Boomstick has like zero chill here. I think last episode he had recently gotten divorced and was still trying to get over it, and by the time this episode rolled around, he was pretty much letting his pent-up aggression out with all the out-of-pocket hypotheticals and innuendos. And unlike other moments like this earlier in the show, if you don't find it funny, it can at least be chalked up to harmless immaturity and doesn't dethrone the fighters. Don't try to act too innocent though, I can see right through you. Even Wiz gets to fire off some shots, which I will allow because those movies are poopy. This fight falls into a choreography category that has and still low-key peeves me off. For you see, it's the classic one character dominates the whole time with little interruption right up until the very end where the other fighter pulls out one move to win out of nowhere archetype. It's obviously not as bad when the loser gets no meaningful hits throughout, but I generally prefer more more back and forth in my fights. I at least understand why this is done so often for movies. The story takes precedence and the filmmakers clearly want you to root for someone in particular. But for a versus show where both fighters have fan bases rallying for them, this kind of concept only works for me in very specific instances without coming off as spiteful or, ironically enough, lazy writing. And you know what? I realized recently that this episode is one of those specific instances. And that is precisely why it's my second favorite episode of the entire season. On its own, this presentation is incredible. Despite not having those same 3D camera shots like in the last two sprite fights, the environment is used in a genius way. They start off on top of a building at night and slowly work their way down to the very bottom for the final portion. In between, there's aerial shenanigans and a really intense hallway scene that utilizes a bunch of Bruce's gadgets and is great at showing off one of Peter's strongest advantages. Which begs the question, why did Peter let himself get ragdolled for so long? This puzzled me for the longest time until I finally got it. This battle isn't just about their different tool sets, but also their juxtaposed mindsets when fighting baddies. Pete is a quipper, and his big strategy is jeering his opponents into frustration so that he can catch them off guard enough to win. Bruce, on the other hand, is way more straightforward and no-nonsense when dispatching goons. Spider-Man wasn't taking the fight seriously, at least when compared to Batman, who's completely unfazed by Peter's banter and has arguably better, pure fighting prowess. It also explains away another pet peeve of mine, when one fighter gets voice clips and the other doesn't. Bruce doesn't talk much to begin with anyway, and here it goes to show even though he's got a wide assortment of gadgets in his utility belt, he left all his fucks at home and has none to give. Typical greedy billionaires. For Peter, they use Josh Keaton's voice clips from Marvel vs. Capcom. And next to Yuri Lowenthal, he's one of my favorite Spidey voices ever. I know they weren't recorded for this video, but he brings so much charisma to the role, and each chosen soundbite ramps up in intensity along with the fight. I especially love this little whoopsie. Anyone else get toasty vibes?
You got a black belt and stupid if you think you're gonna beat me. It's just not your day, pal. Having fun yet?
The best is saved to the very end when Spidey finally drops the carelessness and sets up one of the most satisfying killing blows on the channel. From the physics to the sound design to the incredible payoff, I love this death even if it's definitely impractical. Yes, this level of violence is unheard of for Spidey.
Web swing!
Heck, even for death battle standards, this was surprising. But it was over the top just enough to be entertaining. It goes to show how powerful Peter really is when he doesn't hold back. And the OG death concept would have been way more gruesome anyway, so count your lucky stars if you're squeamish. Get used to that being a running theme with Chad, by the way. But more significantly than that, the amount of punishment Peter takes in this battle plays into one of his greatest themes. No matter how many times he gets knocked down, he'll keep on rising back up again and again and again. And nobody knows that sentiment better than Bruce. Look, if Batman can return 1,000 times, I don't see why Peter can't. I'm sure it'll happen sooner than later, but until then, this is the best we've got. And that's not such a bad thing. While not as groundbreaking as Link vs. Cloud, as ambitious as Eggman vs. Wily, or even as funny as Starscream vs. Rainbow Dash, this to me is the most well-rounded episode of Season 1 for having everything you could ask for at the time. But even that pales in comparison to this season's magnum opus.
What would you call that flavor?
Lightning-y?
Yeah, it's lightning-y!
Pikachu vs. Blanca. Shit, I forgot about this one. I'm starting to see why everyone ranks these things from worst to best and not release date. Well, that last moment probably would have been more impactful, but this will be a quick entry. Analyses are good. Pikachu's is super nostalgic to me because of how fucking obsessed I was with Pokemon at the time. Can you guess what I thought of the episode as a kid? And Blanca's has a heartwarming end to it as well as foreshadowing to one of the best character rundowns ever. My favorite bit is when Boomstick tries to go eat eels for electric powers, but Wiz stops him since they have a show to do. Boomstick temporarily relents but insists that he'll prove Wiz wrong later. And I love how coyly excited Wiz is to see Boomstick hurt himself. You can hear the smirk on Ben's face when reading this line.
Fine, but afterwards I'm proving you wrong. Okay.
As for the fight, it's got great momentum, their fighting styles contrast nicely, and the music choices are superb. It's the definition of short and sweet. And while this isn't a fault of the episode itself, Pikachu vs. Blanca does feel a little fillery. With all the animations before constantly one-upping each other and the episode after being this community's rapture, Pikachu vs. Blanca had the unfortunate fate of being sandwiched between the most iconic episodes of the show. A tale as old as time that hasn't stopped since. Hell, the fight doesn't even crack 90 seconds, which hasn't happened since Death Battle Exhibition. So I don't blame people for forgetting this one exists. But at the same time, I still think it's worth remembering. If not for the fast-paced action, then at least the death. Comedic timing at its finest that still cracks me up even when recording this review. This is the kind of anticlimax I can get behind. Frankly, I'm glad this episode doesn't get too crazy on us. It serves as a simple, charming calm before one of the biggest, most momentous shitstorms this side of Steve breaking Twitter. Hold on to your hats, cause it's finally time to talk about the longest and most recognized death battle of all time that to this day has yet to be rivaled in infamy. For the most part.
Step right up, I say, step right up. Try to beat the shit out of Superman. I say, you can't do it. Can't do it.
Oh yeah? Well, I don't like your hair, Mr. White Boy.
Goku versus Superman. Okay, so I sort of lied about the last episode, people do remember it, but not anything to do with the matchup itself. Unless you were a 10-year-old Pokemon fan like me, what really got folks talking was that teaser. To this day, it remains one of the most hype episode reveals of the show, and it didn't even have to use any video footage to get the weight of this announcement across. As a kid, I couldn't even begin to comprehend the history of this matchup and why it was such a big deal that Death Battle was tackling it. But with how the hosts themselves were reacting and the boomier than usual rendition of this show's theme afterwards, I could tell that this was going to be something big.
Somebody get me a motherfucking table to flip!
That and the fact it took 3.5 months for this bad boy to come out. That's 112 days, bitches. Not including the wait between seasons, this hiatus was only ever matched by the one between Fox vs. Bucky and Terminator vs. RoboCop. Also 112 days, coincidentally. And it was supposed to be released on December 21st, the final day of the Mayan calendar. Remember that whole fad? Which lined up with their apocalyptic advertising. But animation issues caused the episode's delay and my dismay. Waiting for this was torture, especially since I was so used to getting death battles whenever I wanted. Goomba vs. Koopa may have been my first episode, but when I watched it, we were already all the way up to Pikachu vs. Blanca at that point. So you can imagine the amount of catching up I had to do when it came to not just death battle, but also Screw Attack as a whole. This episode truly taught me the virtue of patience, and I was beyond stoked when that patience finally paid off. To call this episode huge is an understatement. I don't even know if Gargantuan does it justice. The analysis segments ended up coming out longer than most full episodes. Hell, even just one analysis segment was still longer than the really early ones. We all know that this was an incredibly important episode in terms of evolving the death battle format, and I may get some disagreements, but I think the way analysis segments are handled was the most important. I don't doubt that the methods for presenting information and telling their stories are outdated, but throughout this retrospective, I've been craving that feeling of walking through not only a character's powers, but their history and importance to the real world, which I haven't really been getting until now. This episode does that in spades. It felt like no stone was left unturned. A far cry from even something like Batman vs. Spider-Man, which felt more like footnotes. You can sense the love from the opening note of Goku's analysis. With my nostalgia for this episode, as well as my newly discovered love for OG Dragon Ball, it's impossible for me not to get a little misty-eyed hearing that iconic theme song along with Kid Goku's battle cry. These characters were nothing but icons to me at first, but this was the first time the show had ever caused me to reevaluate and look into the characters more on my own, which really should be the ultimate goal of a show like this. Hell, it's why I wanted to make this review, aside from needing the rent money. If I can introduce even one person to Death Battle, that'd make me feel like I made a genuine difference. Wanna know how little I knew about anything back in the day? I wasn't even aware that Superman got his powers from the sun until this episode. The pre-fight skit is unnecessary. It's a welcome bit of world building for into Death Battle at that point, and I especially love that fan service bit with Vegeta.
Even faster than that stupid transforming hedgehog.
But I don't really know if Goku would jump to this kind of conclusion about there being another alien right away, especially when they know his heroic reputation. This motivation doesn't even play into the fight. Goku heard about Superman and wants to fight him because he's strong. That's all you need. It's perfectly in character, and you get that immediately at the beginning of the fight. I'm glad it's here, but you can skip this entire abridged skit and lose nothing going into the fight. It'd still be this show's longest fight animation even without it. This isn't just one of the greatest fights on the show because of its length. It's how it uses that time that makes it feel as close to a fight on Dragon Ball Z itself as possible. This battle choreography is awesome. It escapes that flying brick feeling that has gotten tiresome over the years and incorporates some actually sick martial arts. The fact that they fly is used so that these already great looking techniques can be enhanced. Hands down, my favorite of these bits is Goku's Super Saiyan 3 transformation. The speed of him interrupting Clark's sentence with the Tatsumaki kick, and then repeatedly slamming Clark's face into the ground is one of the most brutal sequences sequences I've ever seen without being straight up gory. This battle doesn't shy away from making these fighters feel like they've been put through the ringer, from the attack cries to the howls of pain. And the voice actors exemplify this. Michael Agruso is Superman. I don't care if the recording quality is echoey. He encapsulates Superman's essence perfectly, from his pragmatism to his befuddlement to his soft-spoken rage. It's all there, though I do find it a little weird how he doesn't say anything in the climax, not even a grunt.
So, you're an alien too, huh? Game? You think this is a game? I haven't even begun to play.
Lawrence Simpson may not sound exactly like the Goku we know, but I still love this rendition anyway. He doesn't just do his normal abridged shtick, as wonderful as it is. Here it feels like a genuine straight-faced take on the character that we would get glimpses of on occasion over at Team 4-Star.
I am Son Goku! And I am a Super Saiyan! I want to beat you at your best. It's no fun if it's not fair.
Gee, thanks.
These battle cries are friggin' insane! Still some of the best to come out of Death Battle. A lot of thought was put into how their different powers and tools would counter each other. You've got the obvious ways like Superman being weak to Goku's magic pole, and then there are some really creative ones like Goku inadvertently powering Clark up with the solar flare. It's clear they took their time planning this fight out, but the true driving force of this episode's appeal is how these characters were handled. With moments like Goku destroying the kryptonite for a fair fight and Superman taking the fight out of the city so they can get more serious, which is also a great way to give both series love. Even if many consider the research for this episode dubious, it's clear they've done their homework on who these two are as people, with the one oddity being this bit at the end where Goku almost sounded disappointed that Clark didn't die. Another thing they do get right about Goku though is how the escalation is handled. Not only is it in character for Goku to want to test the waters of his opponent's strength before getting to his strongest form, it's a great way to keep the fight interesting for the whole 10-minute runtime so it doesn't drag. Which would have been a really easy trap for the fight to fall into when we were so accustomed to fights barely even reaching 2 minutes. And it's that runtime that makes this feel more like a Dragon Ball fight than any of their future ones. This whole episode is a love letter to both series. The music choice is great, there's a bunch of iconic items and abilities, as well as fun usage of their tropes and callbacks like the Kaio What moment. Even when I hadn't watched TFS's stuff yet, I still found it funny. But if it weren't for the length, these moments wouldn't have gotten nearly the same amount of time to sink in. We wouldn't have gotten these fun conversation breaks where the characters learn more about each other in natural ways, which is great for showing their battle intellect. And we certainly wouldn't have gotten a climax that still holds up to this day and is one of Death Battle's finest achievements in dramatic tension. I love how it all culminating in the show's first planetary explosion would have tied neatly into the whole Mayan calendar thing. Imagine if it did release on December 21st, and when everyone got to this scene, there was a massive flash of white light outside their window. After all the hype and build-up, there was no better way to end this episode. It was a level of destruction unheard of at the time. And even when the show would start to introduce universal destruction and reality warping, we've rarely gotten anything quite as impactful or jaw-dropping to this day. A perfect note to close out this long-awaited fight, and then the ending results kick in. Yeah, remember how I said the fight avoids dragging despite the length? It may be shorter, but this conclusion is way too long. A lot of this stuff could have easily been talked about in the analysis portions, and we get bombarded with a formula that makes no damn sense. I know it's been memed to death, but thank God for that universe collision coming in to simplify Dragon Ball scaling. The main thing that stuck with me was the final bit about how inherently different the two are and why that's the ultimate reason Goku can never win this fight. It's a profound piece of character study that stuck with me for years, and that is how you should close out an episode like this. There will never, ever be another Goku versus Superman. Even when there is, it isn't the same. We especially won't get one now given the steady production pipeline, which is ultimately a good thing in the long run. But that storm of chaos leading up to it made this episode all the more special to me. The crew wanted you to know how big this matchup was, even more so than Mario versus Sonic. That's why they created preview videos for the first time to help stir up the hype. And by the way, if anyone has those things archived, please send them to me. It's the closest we'll ever get to a Death Battle movie, not only because of the length and characters used, but the way it's presented. It's still the only episode with a completely unique theme, made by Blake Robinson, and it still worms its way into my head. Check out the rest of Blake's songs, by the way. He's made the music for stuff like the Stanley Parable and Terraria. It's fucking incredible. We would eventually get original music later on in the show, but none of it would be used for the friggin' intro. The length of the fight is also the closest we'll ever get to replicating the cinematic nature of shows like Dragon Ball, giving giving the intricate fight choreography and dramatic twists more than enough time to leave an impact. Not everything from this episode stuck, obviously, as more people were brought onto the team to really fine-tune the research process and presentation of said research. This episode being averse to scaling is especially funny in hindsight, but there's no denying how important Goku vs. Superman is to the show and what it did for versus content in general. It showed off the great heights this genre was capable of reaching. Don't let that dislike bar fool you. We were all mesmerized at the time by this landmark of internet animation. And while it may not have aged the best visually, God, has it not aged the best visually? It's still a fantastic battle with awesome choreography, appropriate use of levity and tension, respectful character portrayal, one of my favorite climaxes on the show to this day, and with the grandiose presentation style, it's one of the few season finales on the show to really feel finale-worthy. I can understand if this episode is a bit too long for you, but keep in mind, it was originally gonna be 50 minutes. Chad even lost his voice while recording. It's sad how many people looked at this grand achievement and chose only to see it as evidence that Ben and the crew are biased towards DC, which, no they're fucking not. We may have gotten plenty of episodes later on that have surpassed it, but there will only ever be one true Goku vs. Superman. Now that the behemoth has been conquered, we can finally get to the fun part. Reviewing every episode in 10 words or less. You'll never guess what number 1 is. Ready? Go! I used to love this episode. Then I grew up. You made up that bar graph. And people wonder why movie episodes are so rare. Very of the time script. Fitting for the Ninja Turtles? Spooky, scary skeletons. Leo's on a rampage. His bloodlust can't be satiated. Shit out, Riptor. Fall on the car. Fucking dinosaur. Look at this massive head wound, boy. I can't bring myself to hate. It's too adorable. Pussy. A moment of silence for the health bars. Anyway, never thought this would inspire the chattiest versus animation ever. Are we just gonna ignore Zangief fucking murdering a dog? He's coming right for us! Briskly walk for your lives! That new Peach title better have a soccer minigame. Short and sweet. The episode's good too. I don't even have a joke. That's just really funny. Maria. Man, I was sheltered if this traumatized me. Why can't I just be normal and hate this episode? Unironically, Ben's magnum opus. But damn, what a cop-out. Consult the Elder Gods now, bitch! Oh, you're fine, Bruce. Just walk it off. Ooh. The day the Earth stood still, and then promptly exploded. You know what? As archaic as this season is, I honestly really enjoyed myself. By all means, these episodes do not hold up on a technical level. Even with the inclusion of a professional animator, it's a far cry from the kind of imagery we get today. But there's something so inescapably charming about this season. At its core, most of it was made by two people straight out of college who wanted to show their love for nerd culture in a fun and unique way. It's why the first episode had Wiz and Boomstick essentially be the same fanboy character obsessed with violence. It was made for nerds, by nerds. But you could tell early on that a switch was flipped within the team that made them realize this had the potential to be so much more. A phenomenon. Even if the fights are crude, when you go into it with the context of Ben's workload, it's easy to appreciate the drive. There are a bunch of interesting ideas here that just needed that extra push to really get the ball rolling. And I've got to give serious props to Lang for taking these battles to new heights. They're not exactly the prettiest, but that's made up for in the choreography, momentum, and how raw these hits feel. It reminds me a lot of Monty Oum in that regard. Hell, even the ad breaks are super charming. Remember when Netflix used to look like this? Or when Gamefly existed? My opinions should be taken with a grain of salt. I am massively biased towards this season given my nostalgic attachment. If you haven't seen a single episode of the show yet, or you don't have a connection to the internet in its infancy, I doubt you'll get much out of these, but I still think you should at least give this season a try. If you're a newer fan of Death Battle who's only seen recent episodes, I implore you to go back and watch season 1 to understand how much the show has grown. If you haven't seen the show at all and are interested in checking it out, I think it's worth watching at least a few season 1 episodes before going to their newer stuff. You never know, it might surprise you. If not, you just had to be there, man. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the start of a long journey ahead of us, and considering what we're up against for next time, pray for my sanity. Arrivederci and stay tuned.
Yoo-hoo! Oh, I am too early.
He must win lowest lanes of the key. Bye.
When my mom told me being a YouTuber was a bad idea, I did not think she meant this.